this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Sunday chat today is a bit of a mixture, but in my mind I'm still circling around this cell collapse related issue. But before even going down that road, I've got some things to look at, and that's not one of them at the moment, despite it being very look-atable. Still somewhere to plonk that for a minute. Go there. First of all, let's have a quick look at the Victoria Regina buds and see how they're getting on. They are swelling up quite nicely now. Now I've not had this one before. It seems a bit odd that, knowing what the eventual colour is supposed to be like, I find it odd that the buds are that pale in colour. But not having seen them before, we shall wait and see. But they're coming on nicely. And the one thing I am pleased with this mount is the moss really has taken. They've got a lovely mound of live moss there. That's good. I like that. That was the idea of using the live moss, was to get the mount to look nice as well as the plant. Now, these are not going to be so easy to get out. The next one is this, again, bought around the same time, the Hookeriana, Dendrobium Hookeriana. Now this has got spikes all over the place. They are incredibly slow growing, but you should be able to see, you know, they are growing. They're on, most of these three-leaved canes have all got some. So, you know, blooms will eventually be got on this. Be interesting to see what they're like. But incredibly slow. Most of the other dendrobiums I've got that grow in that style, once the nubbins push away from the cane, they normally pick up a bit of speed. And then this one is for Insa. Now this is effectively one of his plants. This is Dendrobium linguella, I think it is, linguella, something like that. Anyway, it's the one that's got the purpley leaves, which is going to be sun, but it's not. It's light, and it's a light related issue, but it's things like that we have to take on board. Yeah, but that's for a later discussion. Why I got this down is we've got some buds. 3 tiny little buds. So I can pretty safely say these blooms are not going to be very large, but that's the last thing I expected to bloom. I don't know why. I just did. But we're going to get some blooms on that one. So that'd be nice. I mean, this one's actually growing reasonably well, but it has got this marked effect on the leaves. Now, I'm going to say there is an issue regarding the light, but you have to bear in mind where I've just put that. I've just put that in the roof, haven't I? Now, apart from the short amount of time when the sun is here, yeah, and bearing in mind I put that plant right low down on the rack, so another mount and another plant is between it and the brightest light, and then as soon as the sun moves to there, it's got all the mounts on the other side of this rack in the way. It doesn't get the bright light, but it may have done in the past, but doesn't now. When leaves start turning that colour, you automatically think they're getting a bit too much light, which is probably true, but may not be the whole issue, as I'm now about to get on to. Right, so going back to the problem with the cell collapse on leaves, basically if there's a cold issue, plants are getting too cold, or not just too cold, but a sudden drop, you know, literally that type of effect, taking a plant from inside to say out in your car, when the temperature outside is like -2, so the temperature of your car is similar. Now, okay, your car will warm up relatively quickly once you get in it, I'm sure, but that initial shock can cause cell damage. Longer term exposure to temperatures too low can cause the same thing, as can long exposure to temperatures too high. Always forget the heat issue. Right, going round the subject yet again. A friend said, when things start going wrong that are relatively new, and this is a relatively new problem, even though it existed in some instances last year before we went into winter. It occurred in the winter, and it's still occurring, and we've nearly finished with June, heading into July very shortly. So it's an ongoing issue. So the reasons could be varied and not just one. And he said, backtrack. What have you changed? Several things. You will have heard me said, which I'm now going to retract. I've been doing a lot of reading around this subject. Things pop up out of the woodwork that you weren't actually looking up, but they're in the article. They have a bearing, given the person who was putting that article together, or the scientific unit that were putting that article together in some cases. You've heard me say, I don't think you can overdose on calcium. Keep your calcium stocked up. Oh yes, you can. I'm retracting that. Yes, the plants need calcium. It's essential, as is magnesium. But you can get too much. Now, under normal circumstances, most of the stuff you'll read is geared up to stuff growing in the soil, and the soil itself has quite a major impact on how nutrients work relative to the roots. But we're not really talking about that, because virtually across the board we're talking about epiphytes, aren't we? We haven't got any soil. So, you know, there's a major difference there. I mean, there's an awful lot of writings professing the relatively newly found influence that sulphur has on plants. And it is essential, it has to be there. It's another one of those, it has to be there. But what you can debate is the quantity. And when somebody starts pointing that towards me relating to orchids, and then you look at where they've got the information from, it's all about fields of wheat and corn as far as the eye can see, and the various soil types. These are epiphytes. Don't live in soil. So yes, all plants need some sulphur. Now, I was under the misapprehension, slight misapprehension, bearing in mind we're talking quantities again, my MSU fertilizer doesn't itemise sulphur. The other relatively famous MSU style fertilizer that's European basically, does itemise sulphur. And I've always said the amount it itemises seems a pretty high amount, considering we're looking at orchids here. Yeah, they need some. And I've always said, that's all right, my MSU fertiliser's got quite a few of the ingredients, the lower down ingredients that make up the fertiliser analysis are sulfates. Well, where there's a sulfate, there's sulphur. So I've always thought, there's plenty. Especially, I've got magnesium in there. Well, that's going to be magnesium sulfate, isn't it? That's more sulphur than magnesium. That's its chemical makeup. Look it up. You know, for something like 20% magnesium, you'll probably have 25-30% sulphur in that same granule mix or whatever. So I just assumed it's there. Guess what? It doesn't use magnesium sulfate, it uses magnesium nitrate. So one of the larger ingredients, you've got your NPK and then your calcium and your magnesium. I was assuming the magnesium was sulfate. It's not. So the sulphur in the MSU fertiliser could be a bit lower than perhaps I thought. But then you still have to debate, how much do orchids need? Somebody even suggested that the Michigan State University, when they put this together, forgot about sulphur. Of course they did. get a grip. Places like that, it's not one person working in a fatty little back room, is it? It's a whole department dedicated to doing that work. They forgot? And again. Anyway, so sulphur is an issue that could be relevant, but I'm effectively discounting it. There's sulphur in my MSU mix. Back to the calcium. Yes, you can have too much. Now, in a soil, calcium can have an effect, if there's too much of it, by actually inhibiting some of the other nutrients. Now, although this may not be quite so relevant out of soil, it still could be true inside plants, or on the surface of root areas where things are trying to get into plants and things. You know, you're all based on, the fertilizers are trying to get in based on positive and negative charges, moving this way and that way and all that sort of stuff. But too much calcium inhibits two things: magnesium and potassium. What are they both in charge of? Major influences within the plant. Potassium allows things to move around. It's quite important for translocation, which allows the nutrients to move around and the hydration to move around. So what happens if leaves get a bit hot, warm to the touch? They're overheating and the hydration can't get there because there's a potassium shortage, which is one of the major contributors to that movement around the plant. And it's also relevant in that instance for photosynthesis. So is magnesium, quite a major important factor in photosynthesis. What does photosynthesis do for our plants? Well, it's involved with chlorophyll for a start. And if you ain't got much chlorophyll, you ain't got much green, have you? What do you get instead? Either pale wishy-washy yellows, or in some cases you'll colour up red. The idea being that one is a lack of chlorophyll, the other one is a defence mechanism to stop. Now I'm going to resist the word sunburn, to stop sunburn, and I'm going to substitute across the board light burn. Similar but not quite the same thing. Yeah? Because light, put intensive light on something, it's probably going to get warm. And what happened in here, what little light bulb moment was, I was watering. So I'm standing roughly where I am now. Yeah? And the kit was off, and the back of my neck was burning. I thought, what the hell? Yeah, I was uncomfortable. Okay, it was 30 degrees outside, clear blue sky, sun was pelting on the roof, and I just glanced round at the roof. I couldn't look at that roof, it was so bright. And then that little light bulb came on, that little voice of my friend going, what has changed? What's different? We used to have green shade netting up there, didn't we? Now we've got aluminium stripy stuff. We used to have 2 layers of green shade netting on here. We changed it for 1 layer of aluminium stripy stuff because it's supposed to be so good at reflecting the light away, which in turn stops some heat getting in. Comes in different grades. And I don't know why, but I chose 50%. It's not even close. Far, far too light. So, I'm thinking to myself, if this is burning the back of my neck, what's it doing to the plants? Top shelves and racks. And I went round and started feeling leaves. They were quite warm to the touch. I won't say hot, they were warm. Okay, I had the kit off at the time. But after putting both the fans back on and bumping them up to their second setting, came back out after about an hour, those leaves hadn't changed their temperature much. And you have to bear in mind at this time of year, this is 16 hours worth of that intense light. These plants are not used to that. They come from 12-hour long days. You know, 13 maybe, but not 16. not all day, every day. You have to. A lot of these come from tropical rainforests. Yeah. Well, they don't get extreme bright light for a start. And I keep saying that the light levels in the UK, they're nowhere near as high as in the tropics. The difference between the clear blue sky in the UK and under the trees in the tropics, we could be winning. So, despite the heat, I went straight out, got my steps, which were actually in the front garden from when I was painting the front of the house. I had to get the steps back through, burrow into the shed with a machete, because there's creatures in there that are getting bigger all the time, and find a suitable bit of the green shade netting to put on the roof. Now that's back to front, because the green shade netting went on top of the stripy aluminium stuff. That's wrong, it should be the other way round. To take the aluminium stuff off is a big deal. It's actually screwed onto large heavy battens and they are wired onto the roof. So I just screwed the green netting on the top. So we've restricted the light a bit coming in from the roof. And you have to bear in mind the difference therefore, if that aluminium shade netting is not as strong, as good at stopping light as the green stuff is, then also on the sides here I've only got one layer of green followed by the aluminium stuff. But for a period we only had one layer of aluminium stuff. Over a prolonged period with heat waves involved and the potential for knocking out or restricting my magnesium and potassium. It's there, isn't it? It's just there somewhere. So, first thing to do is undo the changes. So, my MSU fertilizer has got calcium and magnesium in it. That'll do. You get it in your head that, my plants will do better if they have a bit more of that, or a bit more of that. But when you add a bit more of that, you affect the other bits. You've upset the balance. Now there is no perfect balance for all these different types of orchids, because some need perhaps, some are classed as nitrogen hogs because they grow incredibly fast. Well, nitrogen needs some backup or you'll get whippy woppy, flippy floppy growths that will just flop over because they've got no strength in them. So it's important to have the backup. But I'm going to stop adding calcium nitrate simply because there's calcium in my MSU fertilizer. The only thing that needs to be possibly adjusted to make sure that all of the elements in my fertilizer get a go is the pH. So make sure I adjust a high one, perhaps a low one, perhaps one in the middle, and just vary it. That should give everything a go. The strength of the feed I use I don't think is too much of a big deal, because I've spoken to a lot of people about the strength they use to feed their plants, and you've got some really stunk up their food levels, and you think, oh, they got great plants as well, perhaps I should do the same. And then you get others bring plants into a show and says, what level of feed do you use? Feed? Oh, I don't feed mine very often. And they've got great plants as well. There is no one answer. Like I said, there's no one way to grow orchids. But I'm undoing the things that have crept in, irrespective of the reason they crept in. And I'm going back to the fact that my MSU fertilizer is probably good enough. But if there is a bit of a shortfall on the old sulphur front, how do we get round that then? I believe, from memory, no, it's gone. I can't remember whether sulphur is a mobile or immobile thing. The problem with immobile nutrients is you have to have sufficient for them to get to all the places they're needed, because they get to a relevant place and lock on to something and stop. And that's where they're frozen at that point then. That's the problem with calcium. That's why the new growths suffer if you haven't got enough calcium. Magnesium is classed as quite mobile. Not as mobile as some of the others, but it's not an immobile one, it's classed as mobile. So that can get where it's needed. And as such, like with nitrogen, mobile, if there's a shortage in an area, it'll pull it from another area. And those areas where the shortages occur are usually at the front end, the newer stuff. So it will pull mobile nutrients from older parts of the plant. If you take the magnesium away from the older parts of the plant, then the old chlorophyll is going to go down, the photosynthesis isn't going to work as well. So that could account for some pale wishy-washy stuff, but the light accounts for a lot of that. What else does potassium do? What do we do in the autumn to strengthen our plants to take them into the winter? Outside I'm on about now. So it's important, it adds disease resistance and strength into the plants. Calcium just does the strength thing really. It's to do with cell structure and things like that. These all work together really. Can't separate them out. So I'm undoing the things that progressively have changed. Now I have some CalMag. It's old and basically it's not even in the right container because the container lid broke. It was one of those lock lids, you know, that's to stop kids getting at it, and it stopped me getting at it, so a bit of brute strength came in and I tore the lid off basically so it wouldn't close properly, so I had to find another container. But I've ordered some new because if I'm going to add a bit of CalMag, I want some calcium, but I think I'd rather have some magnesium as well. And magnesium sulfate don't mix so good. It's not a mixer, it's a loner. So if you put magnesium sulfates in with other feeds, it'll start, I think, precipitating or whatever the expression is. It'll start grabbing hold of other things, which means they don't work anymore. And it is good at doing that. So it's whoops. Oh, what did I just tread on? Oh, God. I thought it was a cat or something. I just trod on something soft. And now we've got coffee on our socks. But everything in here has just had a dose of magnesium sulfate on its own. Why? It may or may not need some magnesium, but if that's been restricted in any way because of the higher calcium, then it does need that. But it'll give it everything a whack of sulfur straight away, because there's more sulfur in my magnesium sulfate than there is magnesium. So everything in here got watered with just that, straight in the RO water. So they've all had a good dose of that now. Do you know what they're going to get next? Another dose. I'm going to make sure that both of those elements have been stacked up a bit before we start introducing the others again. I don't want the magnesium grabbing hold of anything and becoming less effective and making other things less effective. So you can get in those plants on its own. Get in there, do your stuff. And then it'll be there ready for when a little bit more comes in along with everything else. It should be able to sort itself out. Now whether this is going to solve my problem or not, I don't know. Given that it's quite a long-term problem, it could be quite a long-term solution. But I'm backing up. So first of all we go back to the level of shading I used to have before I started thinning it on the ground, thinking I'm sure these plants, everybody says, oh, if it won't bloom I'll give it more light. Yeah, well there can be too much, and it's different. You're on a windowsill or something or other and you've got no shading at all or something or other. Like I've said, you know, come the spring, you know, the sun starts changing its position. It comes round earlier in the day or stays longer. And you suddenly find a plant that's actually in the sun through the glass. That's sunburn. What I've got is excessive light over prolonged periods. And if there has been an interaction with the nutrients that have meant everything can't get round the plants, because once it starts warming up in here, everything in the plant starts speeding up. Yeah? And they lose moisture quicker than they ought to. And again, if you can't get it up through the roots, because the one nutrient that really makes that work well isn't there in the quantities it's needed, and it can't work as get around the plant as well as it could do. You're going to get bits of the plant inside that are drier than they should be. It's in there somewhere. I'm not saying I've got the answer, but I'm saying it's in there somewhere. And this is what I call circling round a problem. Yeah? We've circled the wagons. We still haven't solved the problem though. The Indians are still out there. I love those old films. So politically incorrect nowadays, aren't they? Whose land was it? Whose land should it still be? I don't know where my loyalties are. I just thought I'd show you that. That's my Shelob Tolkien. That's a, what's that class as? A Bratonia, I think it is nowadays. It's basically a mix of Brassia and Miltonia, whatever you want to call it. And it's a lucky break. I mean, whoever produced the cross just came up with a balance of colours, a good star shape, so a good Brassia star shape without the petals and sepals being so long that they're out of proportion like some of the Brassias are. And these colours on the lip just works right. They just came. It's like the Miltonia Sunset, whoever produced that cross. You think, is that the colours I'm going to get? They're not going to work. They don't work together. But as soon as you see the flower, they do. So if you list the colours that are on a Miltonia Sunset bloom, you think, well, they don't go very well together. I wouldn't want to paint my kitchen that colour. Anyway, I like that a lot. However, this is a, it's still a hybrid, but this is more a Brassia. Now, that's more like a typical Brassia. And you've got petals and sepals here that I've got to get back here to even get them in shot. You know, they go from here to here. That's 10 inches. 10 inches of bloom, and yet the actual bloom is really, the bit you look at is this tiny little bit in the middle. Yeah, so for some people the Brassias don't really appeal. Shh. Somebody else you to speak. It's not your turn. It will be soon though. Yeah, so I'm still skirting around this issue. I still don't know whether I've hit the nail on the head, but when somebody whispers in your ear from a distance and, you know, just what have you changed? It's right under your nose. What have you done? And then go back. And even if you can't work out what the bit that you did that caused a problem, just undo the bits you've done. Go back to where you used to be. And especially in my case, where I used to be was actually okay. Did I really even need to change stuff? In your head you've got this, but I'd love things to be better. There comes a point where in your environment, with your skills and your set of plants, you can't actually get any better. It's got to that as good as it gets for the majority of your plants. You still hit on an odd one or two where you think, God, if I could keep that one cooler, that would grow so much better. And then you think, but I can't. So that's as good as it's going to get, you know, in my environment sort of thing. So, yeah, I think I'm there, somewhere in there. You think it's going back a few winters now. We had a serious problem with the big, the Vanda that has the big purple-blue flowers on. Got some real horrible markings on the leaves. That was put down to cold damage, because it was cellular type damage. Yeah, it's still there. Those marks are still on those leaves. They're never going to go away, but they haven't come back since. And also, over a few winters, I kept dropping my winter temperature down a bit at a time, didn't I? Well, let's put it back up one when we get there. We'll think about winter now. Plenty of growing to do yet. And thanks for all the congratulations on this thing. It has done well. I suspect it's going to do well again next year. Yeah. The Hercoglossum does just as well. It always just falls at the wrong time when it's at its peak. Plus, it doesn't take such a good photo as this one does because the blooms are so much smaller. But nonetheless, that's that. Yeah. So, oh, I can't show you. It's up the back. You'll remember I had a Cattleya that's a very, very tall Cattleya. It doesn't the bulbs stay very close together, and it had a beautiful cluster of red, my only deep red coloured bloom basically, beautiful red cluster of blooms that 2 months ago went in the Bournemouth Orchid Society competition and with another plant, and it was the other plant I expected to get the first, and the red cattleya got the first, which was a real surprise. That had a lovely strong new growth, probably about 2 centimetres long. Did you hear that little word in the middle there? Had. Clumsy oaf knocked it off. So that's that new growth gone, and it only had one. Now we've got that horrible wait for the plant to react to losing its new growth and deciding where it can push another one out, and that could take 6 months. So I've lost that growth, which would have been the next lovely big cluster of red cattleyas. It happens. I'm sure most people have knocked a new growth off, or a spike, a set of buds. But I showed you this one, but for those who didn't see it, I snapped the top of a new growth off one of my cattleyas, caught it on a shelf as I was putting it away, and I broke the 2 top leaves off. Well, they carried on pushing on a little bit because they were just little stumpy bits, but the buds have still decided to grow. So obviously I didn't damage the buds, they're still pushing on. I don't know whether they're going to be as good as they should be, but it was one of those all was not lost. Right, so everything's had a dose of magnesium sulfate, and that went in heading up towards the strength I feed at. Why I pushed it up to that level, because normally if I'm using an additive it goes in somewhere between 40 and 60 parts per million on top of the feed I've already got in there. They don't tend to go in on their own when I'm using them. So that went in at quite a high level. And I just remember, I think it was a video that Ed did when he said, right, everything's going to get Epsom salts today. It was something like 200 parts per million. Well, all his plants didn't die, so I thought plants can obviously take a reasonable level. But when you're putting in effectively 2 of your nutrient elements in one go, and that's all they're going to get, I wouldn't go too heavy. You know, it's not, you have to sort of bear in mind, magnesium sulfate, could it, on its own, can it even be classed as feed? Because both of the elements that are going in there don't work on their own. They need other stuff to be able to do their job. So is it feed? You know, calcium nitrate. You could say, is that feed? Well, unfortunately, you'd have to say yes, because calcium nitrate's actually got nitrogen in it, which is feed. So anyway, that's what I've adjusted. I've put an extra layer of shade netting on the roof. The roof has now got a little bit more shading than it used to have, simply because there's 2 layers up there, because I can't be bothered to take one off. But the one that was up there wasn't good enough, so that's that. Probably 2 months' time that extra layer can come off, because the sun will drop lower in the sky as the months progress. So it'll be coming in more at an angle. So, you know, this time of year it's as near overhead as it's ever going to get. So, I mean, we've had our longest day now, but the day lengths don't change noticeably for a while yet. So, yeah, so we've gone back to extra shade netting. We're going to stop whacking calcium nitrate into my feed almost every time, because I think that's overdoing it. It would guarantee that the calcium gets to every part of the plant, being a non-mobile nutrient, yes. But is it OTT? This is what I'm getting at. So undo these things, step back a bit, and just ease off. I very rarely use my seaweed supplement. There's some good stuff in that. Perhaps I ought to start adding a bit of that in a little more often. But again, you know, you find articles, orchid societies and things like that where you say, you know, oh, I use CalMag on a regular basis, once a month. That's regular. It's only once a month. Not every other day or every other watering or anything like that. So I think I've just got too heavy-handed with the supplements. bearing in mind that is what they are. You're boosting parts of your fertilizer, but only parts of them. And that could have an adverse effect on the other parts. That's all I'm saying. Calcium nitrate would probably work fine on its own as a boost, yeah, but not as often as I've been using it. So we're cutting back. So a lot of the time when I'm feeding, I'll just be using my MSU fertilizer. So we will leave it at that. And unless something new comes up or I see a major change, which I won't, there is no major change to look for. That's never going to mend. You know, the only change that's going to happen on plants with leaves like that is that the leaves fall off, which they will eventually, especially on the one I've just taken that off of. Yeah, so there's no change to look for. The change is that we don't get any new stuff. Yeah, that's the idea. And even that could take a bit of time before the damage stops coming through, because it's a slow process. The damage doesn't show up instantly. It takes a while, so it could be a while before the damage stops. But that's the goal, is to not get any more. And we'll go from there. Something else on my mind I meant to say, but that can be another video. Oh, my trip out to see those native orchids that I didn't find. There's a major site where there's hundreds and hundreds of them, about 2 miles from where Hannah lives. I didn't know. I always knew that site was there, and I always knew it had some orchids, but I found somebody who did a dissertation on that site based on the effect of old quarry works on a chalk hillside and what effect it's had on the different plants. It wasn't specifically for orchids, but they were there. And this plant's in the wrong place and it's growing like a weed. So, you know, at some point I will possibly get to that one. And there's another one I'd love to visit. It's nearly 60 miles away, but it's motorway almost right to the door. So I could probably get there in an hour, or maybe an hour and 10 minutes. But when you get there, it's a tiny little place. It's literally not very big at all. So it would be a long trip for not much when you get there, apart from finding these orchids, which I want to find. So I may do that one. Whereas the other one up near Hannah's place has got 9 known orchid species of our native orchids. Now 2 of those will have gone over. The early purple orchids, they're gone and forgotten. They've got fly orchids there. I've only ever seen them in one place and I had to go specially to see them. They're probably already gone over. There's frog orchids there, musk orchids, pyramid orchids, common spotted orchids, and the ones I'm looking for, which I'm not revealing the name until I find them. But it hasn't got the word orchid in it. There's a clue. Now, those of you who can do a bit of work or know our native orchids, it's got the word marsh in it, but it hasn't got the word orchid in it. So it's not a marsh orchid, but it could be a marsh something else, couldn't it? They are pretty special. I'm determined to get to see them this year. And they're coming into their season. They're normally classed as July and August blooming, but on the Facebook groups they're early this year, and there's many pictures on the Facebook groups of them in bloom. So they're out and about. So you know, it'd be nice to get some nice freshly open ones rather than ones that have been beaten flat by the wind. So we'll give that a try. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by. And as far as this leaf damage subject is concerned, in my book it's closed. I don't need to say any more, and I'm certainly not doing any more investigations. I've done more than enough. And I'm just hoping that I've gone round it in enough circles and eliminated enough of the possibilities that somewhere in those changes I've hit the nail on the head. And that's as much as I'm prepared to do at the moment. Just backtrack. So, see you next time.